Food waste has the rare privilege, I would say, of being quite squarely at the intersection of business case and sustainability. Like food waste isn't good for anybody. There's food waste and there's food loss, and no one's in favor of any of it, right? It's enjoyed bipartisan support, historically. For example, if you look in the regulatory, sphere of things, and it's kind of this like sneak attack for sustainability as well, because we don't actually need our customers to care about sustainability. It's helpful if they care about sustainability, but we don't need them to. And so in a world today that is increasingly, let's call it chaotic, it's just like this it makes sense for everyone to do this. And that gives me a lot of optimism that we'll figure this out.
In this episode of Re.Vert Ventures, we speak with Dan Kurzrock, founder of Upcycled Foods, formerly known as ReGrained, a leader in the upcycling food movement. Based in the Bay Area, we hear Dan's story from brewing beer in his dorm and the exposure to spent grain, to how this passion led to finding ways to leverage it. We hear about how he continued this interest and experimented through different phases of his professional life as a recreational entrepreneur, as well as doubling down and committing to this enterprise full-time. We learn about his journey with creative financing, scaling different business models all around upcycling different foods for his brand and others, and of course the importance of reducing food loss and the impact that it has for both businesses and people. This is a great case study for thinking differently about waste, finance, and the potential for win-win solutions. Enjoy. Dan, I appreciate your time, and I'm glad that we're able to speak today. For our audience, I'd love for you to just give a high-level overview of your background and how you started ReGrained.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Yusuf. Great to be on the show with you and share a bit of our story. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I identify as an entrepreneur. Fell into this business as a undergrad, actually. So I was a student at UCLA. I came back from winter break, my freshman year, back to the dorm with my buddy, and he'd learned how to brew beer during winter break with his uncle. And he had the brilliant idea and insight that we could go buy the ingredients to make beer, use the equipment. There's nothing wrong with that as 19-year-olds. So as long as we didn't drink the beer, it's fine. And of course,
and you didn't drink the beer, of course.
We abided, and we abided by withholding our imbibation. Anyway, but the point being, we got really into this hobby of making beer. I loved it. But as we got more sophisticated about it, we're making beer almost every week, started to realize how much grain we were using in that process. Because have you ever made beer before?
I have not, no, but I'm familiar with the process.
You want to kind of quiz you? What are the ingredients for the audience?
Okay, actually,
there's only four. There's only four.
No, Dan, you're asking the wrong person. I mean, I drink alcohol, but I do not drink beer actually at all. So sorry.
Well, the one that everyone forgets is usually water. But beer is made with water, with grain, typically barley. It's called malt as well, which is just like sprouted grain, effectively. Hops and yeast. And the brewing process, you're basically extracting sugars from the grains, and you do that by adding hot water to it and making like a big batch of porridge, and then the brewers are basically draining the liquid from it, which is now sugary water called wort. That goes on to be boiled, and hops to it to flavor it, and it's cooled down, and then yeast gets introduced, and that's where the magic happens. Just like with brand yeast, is what makes it rise. It's what turns grape juice into wine. That's what turns barley into beer. But that process, you're continuing with a liquid, you still have the solids, of the grain from the beer making. And it's quite a lot. It's about 1 pound on average, for like like every 6-pack of beer of like a Pilsner strength beer.
Yeah.
IPAs are, a little like more grain relative to water. Beers where you've got more of those grains up front that are used. And from the brewer's perspective, they're spent. You can't do anything more with these grains because they've taken the sugars, and that's all that's needed to make beer. For anyone listening who knows, about just the composition of any crop, there's more than just sugar, in these materials. There's fiber, there's protein, and all of that is left behind from the brewing process. So here I am as an underage undergrad, brewing beer every week, loving the hobby, but every time were brewing, getting left with what felt like a massive amount of food and nothing to do with the food. And so I started asking questions. Did not have a background in food science. I do recognize now in the past that like I did have some entrepreneurial tendencies, even like in high school leading up to college. But it wasn't like I set out to start a business. I just was asking bigger and bigger questions. And
Sure.
what I realized is that what I learned is that yes, this material is very nutritious. I knew from tasting it that it had some great flavor. I knew from research that there had been small scale versions of using this in bakery items and different food products for basically as long as human history.
Mm-hmm.
Yet walking into the grocery store, couldn't find any products that had this grain that had already been used to brew beer in as an ingredient. And so I set out to try and do something with that. The original idea was really very simple. It was, hey, every time we're making beer, we're making this grain. We can make bread with the grain, sell the bread, use the proceeds from that to buy ingredients, and we could brew for free. That comes together. So that was the original business model, which has evolved considerably over the years. I'm sure we'll get into what we're doing today. But my background really was just as a scrappy college student trying to be resource efficient with this hobby that I loved, but that was creating what seemed like an overlooked opportunity to do another hobby. So I started brewing beer and baking bread.
Yeah.
And that was the early days of what became ReGrained, which then became Upcycled Foods Incorporated.
Yeah, I love that. What were you studying at the time?
Yeah, I was probably undeclared at the time that I started making beer. Just kind of like liberal arts. I ended up majoring in economics. I did some like political science and public policy, so nothing like food related. I was at UCLA where there's not like an undergraduate business program. But in final quarter at the school, we were offered an entrepreneurial elective class, and so I did take that class. In college, I did count towards my econ degree, and was able to work on the earliest versions of a business model here in that context.
Mm.
Yeah, and then I later on went on to do a sustainable MBA program at a place called Presidio Graduate School, and so once I had this idea, we could talk about those intervening years, to school to try to make this a full-time venture. There was many years where this was a joke, in retrospect, it was a recreational entrepreneur. So we don't have goals beyond just doing the thing.
Yeah.
Although the more questions we asked, and the answers to those questions, led to what became a very compelling opportunity for me to so far to advancing the company specifically, but also the concept more generally, and kind of helping create a more efficient food system where we're doing more with what we already have. We have a lot. This all gets tied into. This was 2000. Just put in a timeline. This was 2009. My first batch of beer, probably 2010, when I made my first loaf of bread with the grains.
Yeah.
The national food waste conversation really picked up momentum. I should say global. It was some global studies. Those were started getting published in like 2013, 2014, and it was like all of a sudden I found people, as it relates to the mission of wasting less food, putting food to its highest best use, feeding people, and I'm sure we can get into all that. But those were the early days.
Totally. I love that. I want to understand a little bit about that transition, because to this point, you have this idea, you have this passion for something, you found this niche that you're really doubling down on and exploring and asking the right questions and acting on, most importantly. But at the same time, you're graduating college and you entering the workforce. I know you had a stint at a company called Bright Edge. So you were at Bright Edge and you were working as an employee. Were you still doing this sort of upcycling, brewing activity on the side, and you knew that this was something that you wanted to sort of develop? Or talk to me about that time in your life and where your mind was at during that.
Well, I loved your bringing forward this idea of taking action on ideas, because that's really been a key driver for me, and that's not my favorite definition of innovation, is putting creativity in action. The action part is what's really critical. And for me, we went from that decision to acting on the answer to the questions about what to do with the grain that's left behind. And when I found myself as a as a what's called an undergrad, those years after after college, and I had a real job, so to speak, and it was a full-time job. It was a startup, very fast-paced Silicon Valley startup, and I was doing well in that job.
What were you doing, may I ask? What was
Yeah, I
your
was
role?
doing the first job was just they called it demand generation, right? So it's like
Okay,
a lot of cold calling, cold
gotcha.
emails,
It's a sales role.
sales,
It's a sales role.
top of funnel sales.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was this company is still around. It's a software that's initially started as being a solution for search engine optimization, helping companies get found on the internet. It's obviously changed a lot over the years, but I joined it was like a Series B startup, at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I was still doing this on the side. It was like nights and weekends, and I mean, that's the key. Was with being passion is a really important, probably the most important currency I think you have as an early stage entrepreneur. Like, I loved this. I rejected the idea that I had to drop everything and pursue this entrepreneurial idea full time right away. That was something that we got some advice from advisors who had been entrepreneurs, and you see a lot of glorification of the narrative of dropping out of school is like the most extreme example, right? To go pursue your idea, or turning down a job to go do this, and there's a lot of lore, about that, and it just didn't feel right for the path that we were trying to carve for some reasons that we can get into. But where I ended up, through that thought process was, hey, I'm going to go get a job. And I'm going to see what I can do with this on the side. I loved it. I was passionate about it. I would make the time for it. You have a lot of time in your 20s relative to, now I've got 2 kids and there's so much going on. You have time. You just have to allocate it in your 20s. And what the business looked like at the time, I mean, it's one of the things you can't control as an entrepreneur is timing, right? And in California, there was a bill that passed like right around the time that I graduated from UCLA. It was related to what's called the cottage foods industry. And the short of what it enabled was for home kitchens to produce food products, certain types of food products, that could be then sold at farmers markets and sold online. Some caveats to it, right? But all of a sudden, you didn't have to go straight from having an idea to trying to launch like a national brand. You could do this in a home kitchen, and so it was a home kitchen business for the first couple of years, a cottage foods business where we were, making everything by hand. At the time, we had no idea how we could process industrial quantities of grain from breweries. We were literally using ovens, and we were trying to prove that on the demand side of the equation, we could create products that people would want. And through that process, we learned that we would need to figure out some way of processing the grains. It's not with processed foods. It's kind of a hot word right now. It's just mix. When I say process, I mean is take something that's very wet and unstable and basically turn it into something that looks like a flour that can be used in a food product. So there's processing that goes into making flour, right? For those who are less familiar with the food industry, and there's ultra processed foods. There's a whole other thing. And so we, those early years, it was working with initially our own home brewing supply, and then we signed up for our first actual sales event. It was like it was a Town Nut Festival, and we got our booth together. We realized, wow, we actually don't have enough of our own grain to make enough. At the time, we were making granola bars as a proof of concept product, and so that's when I started putting my cold calling skills to work. Started cold calling breweries, and established a couple relationships, and we'd go and we'd pick them up in a Subaru, and process them in a home kitchen. It wasn't until several years later when I decided it was time to, I had enough conviction around the idea that I wanted to go pursue it full time. Mm-hmm. But I also wanted to sort of kind of mitigate, I guess, some of the risk by pursuing a graduate degree, at the same time. So I saw it as doing this sustainable MBA program as a way to have a better chance of pursuing this idea that I was really passionate about. If it didn't work out, I went to the 2-year program, funding, or any of those negative outcomes you could think of, I would still be in a position to, pivot into something else. And so it was during that time that we met the USDA and established a collaborative research and development agreement with them. I can share the details of that if that's interesting. But that's where the breakthrough came around, hey, this is actually a scalable business, which was key to it being an investable business, right? So we figured out that we could actually process industrial quantities of brewers. Because if we're doing a pound for every 6-pack, that means at home scale we're using 30 pounds for a 5-gallon batch of beer. But even the craft brewery down the street is using thousands of pounds in a single batch. After they've used it to. So once we realized that we could actually scale the product side of the business, I felt confident in putting the plan in front of some investors, and we talk about our investment path too. But that's the business didn't become full time. I don't consider really the true start of the business to be until about 2017 when we closed some funding, and I was not doing my co-founder pursuing careers, we were putting everything into advancing this idea. So it was kind of like the recreational entrepreneur phase, and then the full-time entrepreneur phase. And for us, that was a slow burn.
Yeah, it was a slow burn, but this is an important side of the story that I think a lot of the times people overlook. To your point earlier, there is this lore, there is this glorification of entrepreneurship, this super risk taker who drops everything and makes $1 billion company in 2 years type thing, and a lot of and everything else that sort of surrounds the idea of entrepreneurship. And part of this conversation is to really highlight, what different paths look like for different people and in different scenarios, and how individuals get to that endpoint of having a successful business that aligns with their interests, aligns with their passions, obviously solves real problems in the world, which yours does, because food waste, and we'll get into that later, is just the biggest low-hanging fruit in a way of the climate crisis. Dan, you mentioned sort of taking this MBA as a hedge against your bets. Would you consider yourself a risk-averse person or a risk-tolerant person?
I don't think it's binary. It's kind of a cop-out answer. I recognize that it's the same thing with introvert, extrovert, right? I guess, compared to the general population, I'm a risk-tolerant person, but I am very strategic in how I take those risks. It's the same thing with the sports I like to do. I'm very into gravity sports and skiing and biking and things like that. And it requires a risk tolerance that is greater than the general population, right? But I am very careful to reduce my risk in activity by being strategic, about different aspects of it. And so there's I would say that I guess I identify in the middle, because I'm not one to go all in on something without a hedge, but I'm willing to shoot the shot, and I'm a big believer in getting as many shots at goal, as possible. And I'm a big believer also in thus, generating as many opportunities as possible to have those shots at goal. And, some people characterize that as luck. And, there's a famous quote from the basketball coach, John Wooden, luck is where preparation meets opportunity, right? So you've got to be ready to see when you have an opportunity to take that shot. You've got to be prepared to take that shot. That's where luck comes from. And so a lot of our journey, there's been a lot of setbacks. There's been a lot of times where it's been one step forward, 2 steps back, one step, even more like 1 step forward, 1 step back, where it just feels like you're treading water, right? But just continuing to try to generate those opportunities to advance, what you're doing. And that definitely takes a level of risk tolerance. But I'm not the kind of person to be like, all right, we got all or nothing, all in on this. It just doesn't, it doesn't make sense for the kind of business I was trying to build. It was more of in retrospect, I wouldn't have characterized it like this at the time, but I think in retrospect, the mentality is much more of a small business mentality to growing a business. Like we were, we did the thing where we maxed out credit cards and, all of that, but we were focused on cash flow. And, at some point we needed external investment. We can talk about what that progression looked like. But in the earliest days, it was a cash flow business, and we thought it could be huge. And it's much bigger than it was at the time, but it still is nowhere near the full scale potential of what this business model can be globally. But that doesn't mean that the way to do that is to raise tremendous amounts of money and, burn it as as quickly as possible. Some of the other companies that have been in the startup space and even the food tech space
Mm-hmm.
specifically. And so, yeah, that's how I would characterize my risk tolerance. It definitely
Yeah, no,
appetite for it, but
yeah,
I'm strategic about it.
that makes sense. No, I think that's a really smart way of going about not just business, but as you said, sports and other aspects of life where risk is a factor, and that's honestly a lot of things of life.
Yeah,
You talked about your co-founder, and you had some experience in
yeah,
sales. Tell me about the dynamic between you two. How did you guys find each other? What
yeah,
did he bring to the table? What did you bring to the table? And how did you guys complement each other?
yeah. So my original co-founder was a guy, Jordan Schwartz, who I'm still friends with. We met in kindergarten, uh, grew up together.
No.
We were not like best friends to start the business together. We became very close through starting the business.
Mm-hmm.
We grew up in the same community, the Reformed Jewish community of the Bay Area, to different summer camps, but we went to the same high school,
Yeah.
had a lot of the same values. We happened to go to UCLA together. And Jordan is very much like yin to my yang, so to speak, in a lot of ways. We both shared a similar worldview and value set and had a lot of trust together. But he was studying accounting, and he was almost dropped out of school to become a chef. So he was also a foodie, very talented chef, very aspiring chef at the time. And the way that we divided things up was inspired by a book that we both read that was about Brooklyn Brewery, actually. And it was called Beer School. I thought originally after the like homebrew hobby, home baker thing, the idea was to have a brewery that was also a bakery and kind of this like closed loop concept.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were seeing the successful craft breweries. This is a time when more than 2 new breweries were opening a day. So it was like a really hot space.
Yeah.
And one of the really influential books that I'm reading was Beer School by the founders of the Brooklyn Brewery. And they talked about how they divided things as Mr. Inside and Mr. Outside. And we kind of talked along those lines. And so I was very much Mr. Outside, focused on everything external facing, front of house, back of house. It's kind of another way to
Totally.
think
Yeah.
about it in food terms. And we complemented each other in those respects. Jordan is no longer full time with the business. He stepped away several years ago. I have another person who I also think of as who's also a co-founder of the business, who entered the picture once the business was full time as a strategic investor, and then ended up coming in house. And his name is Dalton Allen. He's later on in his career, he's built companies, sold companies. He's been an investor, operator, and was an advisor, and was really complemented a lot of the actual skills that are needed at scale, to take a great idea and turn it into a great company.
Mm-hmm.
And so in both cases, those were very much they're both very much ballasts, to my skill set, which is it's not that I can build a financial model. I can do all of that, but where I get my energy is in creative exploration and relationship building, and really pushing the agenda forward. And so I don't think I'm the kind of person that would start a business on my own. Honestly, I really value a partner, to be everything from a sounding board to a true complement, and a division of labor that then gets, things then get, you start out as generalists, right? And then you start to specialize, as you scale.
Tell me about the money behind the business. How did you guys, just to give clarity, as you said before, the original intention was to be a brewery and bakery. So you brew beer and you use the waste to break bread, and your sales are from beer and from baked goods, effectively, right?
But that was what I should put that in a box, because that was like a concept that we worked through and evolved past while we were still undergrads. So by the time that we graduated from UCLA, the business model that we were seeking to advance was to be a B2B ingredient supplier, where we would work with the breweries as our farm, basically, right? That's our source of raw material, do our conversion step of making something that's then a viable, desirable ingredient with value for the food industry, and then sell that to the brands and the manufacturers that serve those brands, who then sell to retail food service, which then makes it the end customer.
Yeah.
However, we recognized that no one knew what this ingredient was. And we needed to show the B2B customers that it could be something. And so our strategy for doing that, which now is a play that's been run a number of times to varying degrees of limited success, I would say, was to launch our own consumer brand in a very scrappy way, in our case, but make our own products with our own ingredient, and use that as a way to build market awareness and also generate, some free cash flow to fund kind of the back of the house stuff. And so in order to do that, we didn't actually need a lot of money in the beginning. We needed qualifications for a credit card, basically. And that's where my job, my full-time job came into effect, is what I was able to do by being just very frugal in my life. I was doing fairly well, but living
below me
in such a below my means, because I was putting that money, into getting the business off the ground. And that took us through that period of grad school where, eventually we were, we knew that there was going to be a limit to how long we could do that. Our goal was never to be like a national brand of consumer products. We did think that our consumer brand could be successful enough that we could then split that off from the business and then kind of sell that or license that some way, creating some liquidity from what we built there, and then be left with a branded ingredient, which we could then sell, as an ingredient brand, B2B, but would have some meaning because there's something in place that established that with consumers. And like qualitatively, there was some success to that. Like we built a branded ingredient platform. We did not generate nearly enough free cash flow from that business. And we can get into the challenges there. Like COVID happened in the middle of all this too, right around the time of the launch of a product. We got that consumer brand to the point where we were nationally distributed in thousands of retailers. It just wasn't serving the strategic purpose that we needed it to, and so that led to a pivot. But where we first needed external capital was the moment where we decided that we were going to stop being a cottage business and start producing in a commercial capacity and entering conventional distribution channels for the consumer product. And because in order to do that, we needed professional packaging, not just sealable bags with stickers on them. And so we did our first funding on a rewards-based crowdfunding platform that was focused on food called Barnraiser. It's basically Kickstarter, but for food. It's about 30 grand. It wasn't. I'm bringing it up as fundraising in this context because it was a phase change from how we were approaching the business before that. This was sales, of product. And then a couple of years later, when we developed the technology with the USDA and it was time to commercialize that and begin to actually formally enter the space, we got regulatory approval, all the things that we needed to actually sell this ingredient B2B. That's when we realized we needed a larger infusion of capital, and we put together an angel round. And I used my connections from business school to get a job in tech to get the first couple of investors, and brought in maybe 20 investors in that kind of $5,000 to $25,000 check range. Probably raised about 500 grand, and then we put that capital to work. And from there, I can go into each of the instances of this and highlights. We basically raised exactly as much money as we thought we needed for a specific purpose in a rolling way at the time. So we're like, here's our pre-seed, here's our seed, here's our Series A. It was more milestone based with where we were at with the business. So we followed up the equity crowdfunding, the angel round with an equity crowdfunding round. We were the first food companies to do that. A big proponent of Reg CF and Reg D crowdfunding, where you're actually democratizing your cap table. But we did that as a part of a broader capital stack with corporate venture capital, actually, too. And we were actually, in the early days, it feels silly in hindsight with the way the market went. But this was, 2017, 2018, 2019. Like the market was obviously very hot in venture capital at the time. But we really didn't want to raise too much too early. We'd read too many stories about that. We're also really concerned about the integrity of the mission. And we were effectively negotiating some of our partners to invest at the minimum comfortable investing. And we wanted to do it. We, of course, had things we wanted to do with the capital, but we saw the value of aligning stakeholders through the supply chain. So we took the first check was from actually a CPG brand, Barilla. Where most people know pasta, small check, but it came with some
big name,
some big name, and came with some programmatic benefits. Again, happy to go into detail about any of this stuff. We also accepted investment from Re.Vert Foods, who is a still ongoing strategic partner. They're an ingredients business that most people haven't heard of, but they are effectively in the part of the value chain, like very close to where we wanted to be as a business. And then further upstream, we took some investment from Molson Coors Brewing Company as well, who's obviously got vested interest in the development for what is a byproduct stream. So we never did a traditional VC. And we didn't structure the rounds that we did close as traditional, letters of the alphabet, so to speak. And that's kind of the first several years of the full-time side of it. To go deeper, further, at your discretion, Yusuf.
What really is interesting about this is that you're really adaptive in your business model in terms of your cap table, who you're getting investments from, who you're networking. It's not just a traditional sort of model. You're thinking one step further, right? This is a sort of a 301 task rather than a 101 business task, if that makes sense. Were these strategic partners that you brought on, of course, the beer company or Barilla, whoever, the intention not only was for them to fund your operations, but of course to be a partner in this and to test the product and whatnot? Can you speak 100%. to how those relationships evolved over time? How did Barilla specifically, or any other company you want to give as an example, how did they take to your product?
Yeah, I think the Barilla one is probably the most interesting example. I'll get into Re.Vert Foods probably a bit too, but with Barilla, they came in and they said, "Hey, we think what you're doing is interesting. We'd like to," and we had a program in place. It wasn't really a traditional CVC. It was really more of like an innovation program, and not really an accelerator either. Not really there's all these like jargony names that get attached to these things. It's really kind of just like did their own thing. And what that looked like for us was after we received the investment, which we could use, to advance the plan that we pitched in order to receive that investment. Right. We also, independent of that, had the opportunity to come out to their innovation center in Parma, Italy, with our ingredient in hand and work with their innovation team in their. So at that time with our business, we knew was that we had this really interesting ingredient with nutritional value that could fortify a wide range of products. We launched one of those products commercially, which was the nutrition bar. We, at the time, still saw
under the name ReGrained.
Under the name ReGrained. Yeah, ReGrained Super Grain Plus is the name of the ingredient. Most people know us as ReGrained. It's this logo that's on my and we tested at a small scale. Okay, how's this work in pasta? How's this work in tortillas? How's this work in different types of breads? How's this work in cookies? But there's only so much you can do at a home scale, and so when we went out to Barilla, we were able to work with a commercial extruder, for pasta, and have like global leaders in pasta.
Global leader in pasta.
Not only like formulating the experiment, but reviewing different iterations of it. And it was a really cool experience too, because it was very energizing for their team to work with a startup, as well. So it was very like, everyone was just stoked, honestly. It was really positive experience. And we made breads and we made cookies. And, again, like the really key thing here was that we were doing this it was a pilot scale plant, but this is actual production equipment, using our ingredient and validating that it could be done. So the most valuable thing from Barilla wasn't the check that we received. It was the validation that then became a key part of our story. Similarly with Re.Vert Foods, they take raw materials and they formulate solutions, value-added products with those ingredients. So things like breading and coating, blends for proteins. Like you think of like breaded chicken, for example. Like someone has to make those breadcrumbs and season them, and all of that. And there's a lot more that they do than just that. But that's kind of the space that they're in. And so that gave us also, working with their team, the experience of validating the usage opportunities more in the solution space, because we didn't want to be a commodity ingredient supplier. We knew that. And they're not a commodity ingredient supplier company. So we, again, more like R&D validation there. And we also partnered on B2B sales opportunities. So when we went in to present to potential customer, whether it's like a retailer's private label program or a national brand, we would work together because they had ingredients that could work with ours, and so it's kind of a win-win commercially if something moves forward. And instead of showing a slide of concepts, we could go out there and actually have people taste things, and that was really valuable too. So those are just a couple of kind of top of mind examples that speak to the question.
And for our audience, just to give further context, right? At this point, the ingredients that the material you're still working with is spent grain from the beer industry that you're able to procure from local breweries or from some of your strategic partners. Is this correct?
And we made a product. You could think of it as like a powder. It looks like a rye flour. Like it's a little darker than or like a whole wheat flour. Color. So it's a dry powdered ingredient that is the barley that's had the sugar removed from it from the breweries. We tried not to call it spent grain because that suggested it didn't have value. Right? It's a misnomer. That was a big part of our story, right? Hey, this is not spent grain. This is a super grain, and that was the kind of core platform that we were trying to build upon. There's all these applications that we could do from it. I used to say, like, if you can name it, we've regrained it. We have a library of dozens upon dozens of recipes, of different things being made to use, because you can put it in at 10 to 30% depending on the application, and some really great products.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We've since expanded
what
we can do with the brewer's grain beyond core powder, and we've also since started working with other similar thematically similar ingredients that fit that thesis of finding something that's been overlooked and undervalued and turning it into something that can be a solution for the industry.
At what point in time did you guys start to pay yourself within this business?
Yeah, kind of just like with everything else, it was not like, it was incremental. So in the days after I quit my job and went to go do the business school program and pursue the business, it was more like a stipend. It was like that for a lot of years. We're talking like government, basically. Not building for retirement. With that. It's honestly been the hardest part of this whole thing, is the ups and downs, as the founder, and majority shareholder of the business, knowing if and when to, increase that salary. So I've been, from a salary perspective, I mean, it's, we started paying ourselves probably as early as 2016, but it's always been significantly below market rate. And then depending on the performance of the business, that's come up or down. And, always just try to take the long view, on what we're building.
No,
so it's a real challenge, and it's, understandably an impetus, I think, for either raising money, taking side projects or whatever. There's like a lot of it. To your point earlier, there's kind of this like choose your own adventure, aspect of entrepreneurship that I feel like gets overlooked. And so I've got an idea for like a book or something we could do. Like maybe you and I could do that together, Yusuf. But it's like there's so many different ways to do it. And for us, what made sense was to begin to incrementally, pay ourselves as soon as we either had the cash flow or the external investment to do it, but always trying to keep it as close to the bare minimum as possible. Which now sometimes feels silly in hindsight, but it also is a key attribute, I think, of our resilience, because we always kept our overhead to a minimum, and that's what enabled us to survive things like later on we had a venture round. We were going to raise our Series A, like a real proper Series A, which was for us going to be a $6 million for our business, and things fell through with the lead investor, and the round fell apart, and we had to, we were able to. It was painful, but we had that resiliency, adaptability, as you put it earlier, to think creatively and put those things into action, and restructure things in certain ways, and keep going. It was a setback. It wasn't a death blow.
Understood. That's great. Adaptability will obviously has served you and will continue to serve you very well. Dan, taking a step back and thinking about the circularity or the actual environmental
Yeah.
impact of your business, I'm curious to know what and how does upcycling or regraining food differ from recycling or upcycling traditional materials like plastic, paper, and metal?
Yeah. So I mean, so the idea of upcycling was not something we came up with. You know, it was we were very much inspired by sustainability luminaries like McKibben, who wrote Cradle to Cradle, and later actually a book called The Upcycle. And this idea of upcycling is really quite simply taking something and putting it to higher value. So like a recycle, you know, would be to use an example that everyone's familiar with, you know, like aluminum can. Recycle the aluminum can back into more aluminum. Or I often use the plastic water bottle example, but of course, famously now, hopefully most people know that a single digit percentage of all recyclable plastics end up actually getting recycled, right? But like in theory, a recyclable plastic getting recycled back into plastic, you know, that's a recycle. A recyclable plastic getting turned into a textile to make a fleece on a jacket, that's an upcycle. You know, it's creating something of higher value. And you see this at home too. So if you take a jam jar and you turn it into a wine glass, you know, in your 20s, that's an upcycle. Or, you know, if you're like a rock climber and you take your old climbing rope and you turn it into a dog leash, you know, or something like this. This is not like crazy new mentality. And in
For sure.
food, no one was talking about upcycle. We, you know, kind of coined the term edible upcycling, which then became upcycled foods, because we realized that what we were doing was not a recycle. We were not recycle in food would be more like composting to make more, you know, soil to then grow, you know, more food, and that's fine for things that are inedible. But where there's still nutrition that's being left off the table, you know, trying to put that to a higher value, we realize this isn't recycled. There's also one of the things we wrestled with was that this idea that we don't want people to think they're eating trash, right? I mean, there's this like cognitive dissonance around this like sustainability value proposition of, hey, we're reducing waste and you should feel good about this product because it's reducing waste, but also not making them feel like they're dumpster diving, right? Because it's not. So like terms like recycle and repurpose and, you know, things like that to us seemed like it was going to put this mindset on the consumer that we didn't want. And so we went with upcycle, but the challenge with upcycle, of course, is a term that not the average person knows even today. Maybe more people probably know it today. I mean, certainly more people know it today than they did in 2010 or 11 when we first started, you know, using it. But that's, you know, that's kind of what we went with there. So it's this idea of taking something that's already been, in the case of food, cultivated, harvested, processed, transported multiple times, used for one thing, and instead of saying, okay, we're done with this, let's go to the path of least resistance, you know, which is often compost or animal feed. You know, animal feed is a very common use for brewer's grain and has been for a long time. Instead, let's put it to its highest and best use, you know, of feeding people. So going from the path of least resistance to the path of least is really what, you know, upcycling is all
about. Are there food products or categories that are better suited for upcycling? I.e., you know, obviously, you started with the ingredients from beer and grains and using them into baked goods and breads and things like that.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking of other let's say byproduct materials like in dairy with whey or with cheese or things like that. Are there
great example? Yeah, so that's on the supply side. I want to speak to the demand side of this too. So on the supply side, what we realized as we were digging into this too is that this wasn't a new idea in food. So we'll get to, you know, dairy and like more industrial food in a second. But even if you just think of, you know, at home, like the practice of roasting a chicken and then or turkey or whatever, right, and then using the remnants from that to make broth, right? Like that's the same principle, you know, here. In food, you know, I think one of the best examples is dairy. So like whey protein is a side stream from cheese making. There was a long time that cheese makers didn't know what to do with their whey, you know, and then, you know, I'm just going to be reductive about it. Like innovation happened, right?
Jim Bros began to think.
The market was developed, and now whey protein continues to be a, you know, extremely valuable ingredient. So much so that and by the way, this may be apocryphal because I don't know specifically who to attribute this to, but I've heard that there's some cheesemakers where actually whey is a bigger revenue stream for them than the cheese that they're producing. So it went from being a byproduct, an unavoidable byproduct, to a lucrative co-product. And there's opportunities for that almost everywhere you look in the food system. I mean, we can, if you want to play a game, you can pick a crop, and I can tell you some of the things that can be done with the, with the side streams. But where we started initially was where liquids were being separated from solids. That felt like the most obvious. So looking at beer, looking at juice, and like it's like pulp, basically, but it's also, that's a nice name, for some really nice fiber and nutritional attributes that are in some of these fruits and veggies that have been just pressed for their juice. Things like alternative dairy, soy milk, oat milk, etc. Tofu has a side stream. But, a lot of these have a rich history of human consumption in various parts of the world, but not necessarily like our mainstream food products that you'd find in the grocery store today. Well, today it's a little different, right? But just looking back at the time for that. Well, one of my favorite examples to give when I'm doing talks about this stuff is coffee. Most people coffee every day. At least are very familiar with coffee, and the coffee bean is actually the pit of a fruit. That fruit, it's like a cherry. It's a coffee cherry. Has some really wonderful properties, including caffeine, but also antioxidants and things like that. Also, the coffee tree itself produces leaves that need to be pruned for cultural reasons, and those leaves from the coffee plant also can make for a really beautiful tea. For example, that's really some really interesting nutritional properties as well. It's also got a really smooth flavor, so it's got like a lot of the benefits that people associate with matcha, but none of the astringency and bitter taste, which is, I like matcha. It's lovely. It's acquired taste, though, right? It's not like something that most people personally. This is delicious.
That doesn't happen actually as much as.
Yeah, and so that's here's one of the world's biggest crops, right? Coffee, and there's the potential for 3 food products that all have value, for humans. But the global economy has historically, over-indexed on just one of those. And so that's what we see as latent supply, opportunities. And we've been spending years collecting the various dots, so to speak, of where there's these overlooked, undervalued opportunities, like with coffee, cacao, as other examples. But then downstream, it gets kind of interesting because it's not like, on the supply side, it's really quite obvious to create the case of, assuming all the numbers work out, right? And from a sustainability perspective as well, making sure you're not using more energy, for example, and, saving these products and other means, there's like a net calculation that should be done. But it's more or less obvious. It's like, why not have 3 products if you can have 1 product, right? Like that's more revenue diversification. But downstream, that's not why someone's going to buy the product, right? And so I think where, we've seen kind of 2 main camps of, verticals, I guess, of opportunity for upcycled ingredients. One is like what we did with ReGrained, where it's like, here's this new ingredient. It's category defining. It's a hero ingredient. It has unique attributes. It has beautiful flavor. It defines the product that it's in. Then on the other side of it, there's opportunities for functional substitutes for existing ingredients. And so when you think about things like the global commodity crisis for cocoa powder, for example, and how that's serving the chocolate industry. One of the things that we've worked on is a solution that uses the principles of upcycling to create an alternative to conventional cocoa, but it's using upcycling, right? So it's like that buyer doesn't care really. I mean, they care, but it's not like the reason for purchase that it's just produced in this sustainable way. It's solving for a problem, that they have with the existing solution. And so there's kind of some nuance between the supply side and the demand side of a model like upcycling.
No, that's fascinating. To that point, do you feel, or what can you speak to about the unit economics of these upcycled products or co-products, byproducts, etc., versus the traditional inputs? Does this upcycling model does it typically, because of the new steps and new processing stages that it requires, does it add cost that then, let's say, a virgin cacao or other flour or whatnot, their economies of scale prevent the dollars from adding up?
Yeah, it's a really smart question. It really is case by case depending.
Mm.
But I think, one thing that's relatively universally true is that most of these innovations are subscale. And so the unit economics at scale, model out to, and sometimes at present, depending on the case, model out to being at parity or at cost savings relative to their conventional, alternatives. But most of the companies operating in this space are still scaling. And so if you're creating for example, with the ReGrained super grain, kind of one of the easiest ways to talk about it for a long time was as a flour, because you thought, oh, the form factor is a flour. But flour is very different in what it does functionally for like a bread than what the super grain does. Namely, flour has almost no nutritional value, but a lot of functional value for the rheology, for like the forming of the dough, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the super grain is, like, for example, like very fibrous. And conventional flour is, even if you're not even on that big of a scale, you can get flour for 40 cents, 50 cents, 60 cents a pound, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the first sale price we ever had for super grain was $3.50 a pound. We're now, much below that, and we're on parity with the things that are actually functionally equivalent and nutritionally equivalent to us. But like going up against conventional flour, you're not going to have a cost savings advantage for that until you're at the kind of scale that conventional flour production is at, which is they mill flour not in terms of pallets or truckloads, but rail cars, tankers. Like it's just and so most of these, and I like to draw the example of like what we've seen with solar, for example, and the cost of solar energy as it relates to the equipment, the panels required, like that. Solar panels came down in price, if you look at like a 10-year period, like 90%, as things started to scale. Yeah. So, it's kind of classic, like, economies of scale, to speak to there. Some of these upcycled ingredients are cost savings straight away. Others have a very clear pathway to do so. And the ones that don't better have a really strong value proposition for why a premium, because the sustainability is not enough. Ultimately, it can be the reason you exist as a company. It's the reason I care about what I do, but it's not ultimately what's going to turn scale.
So what is that value proposition that an upcycled food can pitch if they don't have a cost savings, or if it's not on parity with the traditional material it's going up against? What wins in this equation? How does the upcycled product win in this context?
Well, it's about delivering ultimately consumer demand. And so if we use the super grain example, and this is kind of coming out of vogue a bit, but for a long time, we're talking about keto, right?
Yeah.
And you could make keto-friendly bakery products using super grain because it reduces the net carb, for example. Or there's an ingredient that is really effective at reducing sodium and sugar, which, a customer who cares, they may have sustainability reports where they care about reducing waste and circularity and carbon footprint and all of that. But they also, most of these like large CPGs now have mandates around like sodium and sugar reduction and external commitments that they made to that. So it's all about finding something that they're already trying to do and showing, this is my view, and showing how upcycling can be an enabling technology to help them get there, and not relying on the merits of upcycling itself, as the reason to win the sale. And I think that's what's one of the most misunderstood things, honestly, about the upcycled food space, is that it shouldn't be thought of as a standalone trend and something's upcycled or not. It should be thought of as an enabling technology to create solutions to problems that the food industry is trying to solve, whether that's sugar reduction or sodium reduction or fiber fortification or plant-based protein or supply chain stability, for example.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and I completely agree. Whenever I'm working with brands or products that are trying to push let's just say, engage in some sort of sustainability activity, at the end of the day, if it's marketed as just that sustainable product or whatnot, it's only going to go so far, and that's not going to go that far enough. If we can't have these solutions be one-on-one replacements for traditional energy intensive, petroleum derived materials or whatnot, then we won't win in the end. Right, the system will continue to play out as it has been, which has been a net negative for the environment. Taking a look at the upstream producers of these products, of the cheese producers, of the coffee millers or whatnot, and you're saying that there's, say an ingredient, you can talk to some upcycling or opportunities within that realm. What prevents suppliers from engaging in those alternative revenue streams?
It's a great question. That's what led to one of our most recent innovations in our own business model, where we opened up what we call our Upcycled Foods lab, and we help companies better understand the opportunities that they have within their four walls, so to speak. And I think one of the key themes here is connecting the dots between the food science, let's call it, and what can be done with these materials, and the commercial case, what should be done with these ingredients, right? And in a lot of cases, there's a hunch that there's more that could be done, but the status quo is working good enough, So with a lot of these materials, let's look at brewing specifically, for example, as an example, it is a source of revenue technically for most breweries. They're selling it for fractions of a penny on the pound for animal feed in its raw form, least resistance, right? You look at a brewery and their core business of making beer, they're not in the food ingredients business, right? So it is, just to be again reductive about it, like it's a distraction to pursue launching an ingredients business off of a side stream when it's hard enough to do the core business. There's obviously some examples of companies, many examples of companies. These are a lot of our partners today, where they are in something that's similar to an ingredients business, but their ingredients business has undervalued, overlooked side streams, and that's where there's probably some of the lowest hanging fruit, so to speak, for what we can do with our lab. But it's not even necessarily a prerequisite for success, because a lot of times what's missing is, okay, well, if we can do this, and if it theoretically pencils out, who are the customers, right? So you can find external customers and help launch a new business model, even if that's just selling to an intermediary, like an Upcycled Foods Inc., to like what we're doing with the brewer's grain, to then handle that sell into that new market. Mm-hmm. So I think there's probably more I could say there, but those are some of the key dynamics at play. And a big piece of it we're finding is just this subject matter expertise that we now have being lacking around connecting what can be done and what should be done, and kind of bringing a model forward that makes sense for all the stakeholders, importantly including shareholders.
Yeah, absolutely. No, everyone needs to be involved in this. Dan, taking a step back, looking back on the last, 10 to 15 years of this operation, of this engagement, is there anything you wish you would have done differently?
Yeah, it's the beauty of hindsight, right? And the curse of hindsight. So with kind of just accepting the question at face value, except for all the learning, right? Mistakes made once are opportunity to learn. I think we underestimated the capital probably at each stage that we should have raised. We were so focused on raising the bare minimum of what we thought we needed to not fall prey to some of the pitfalls that we'd studied and heard about from advisors. I think we kind of overcorrected for that, honestly. And a big aspect of that was underestimating the sales cycle, on B2B ingredients. We knew it would be a challenge. We knew that it would take, we thought it was more like 18 to 24 months. It's a long time for cash flow from a sale. But when you're working with a material that requires so much education, you actually need a lot more time. I think that adds more like 3-4 years. Sometimes 5, depends on a lot of different factors. So I think that's one thing. And capital gives you that time, to do that. it would be too easy probably to say I wish we like hadn't done the CPG brand. I don't know that we would have had the other opportunities that we did if we didn't first show that we could do something. But I do wish we had seen earlier that it was time to pivot away from that model. We had too much let's call it like vanity success, there where we were winning awards and we were getting retail entries and it was exciting and oh my God, it's so fun. You're just walking into a store and seeing like your product on the shelf, right? That I think we were more myopic than I wish we had been, around the full scope of what that bandwidth, was that we were dedicating to growing this brand, this branded aspect of what we were doing. I think it served its purpose strategically for us sooner than when we pivoted away from it. And we really still believe that we could crank out success with the hybrid, CPG and B2B model for a little bit, too long. But in the thick of it, man, it was really hard to see those signals.
Oh, of course. And as you said earlier, every failure, every setback is an opportunity to learn and do better moving forward. And you wouldn't be where you are today without any of those.
We didn't spend hundreds of millions, learning that, right? I mean, that's, so I need to remind myself that, but, there's definitely times where it's like, oh man, if we, had, a little more capital, free capital today to invest in the entrepreneurial horizon of what we're building, it's not, I don't know. It's not that we squandered it. It just is what it is. But that's the question you pose, and that's what comes up for me.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough, man. To that point, what keeps you optimistic about addressing food waste and upcycling in the future?
Food waste has the rare privilege, I would say, of being quite squarely at the intersection of business case and sustainability. Like food waste isn't good for anybody. There's food waste and there's food loss, and no one's in favor of any of it, right? It's enjoyed bipartisan support, historically, for example, if you look in the regulatory, sphere of things, and it's kind of this like sneak attack for sustainability as well, because we don't actually need our customers to care about sustainability. It's helpful if they care about sustainability, but we don't need them to. And so in a world today that is increasingly, let's call it chaotic, it's just like this it makes sense for everyone to do this. And that gives me a lot of optimism that we'll figure this out. It's also one of those things, if I flip that, if we can't figure out food waste, what chance do we have at the rest of it? But we've made a lot of strides. There's still a long way to go, but yeah, it's, it is this area where there's not this like either or, between profit and purpose.
Mm-hmm. I cannot agree more. I think to your point, but I used to work in the sustainable fashion space specifically, and it's a way that I think a lot of people get into the world of sustainability because they like fashion, they like clothes. It's this romantic world, and then they go in and they see how problematic it is. But sort of going into that space even further, you start to see the problems with the larger supply chains and everything like that. And because the nuanced or specific characteristics of that product, there's a harder chance to get it to being a net positive thing for this world. Whereas if we reimagine our food systems, if we reimagine the way that we produce, consume, dispose of, reuse food and organic material, that presents a huge opportunity for a net positive environment. And the business case can be a lot more easily made, which is required to make the change as well. So food and addressing food waste, addressing our agricultural system offers an immense amount of opportunity to address the climate crisis and, of course, spawn a lot of business activity at the same time.
100%. I should put you on a podcast.
Somebody should. I don't know. I might have some connections, but who knows? Awesome, man. But then to that point, last question: what does success look like for you? What does the next 5 to 10 years look like for you and for ReGrained?
Yeah, I mean, you want like a commercial answer here, probably.
No, I didn't want to know.
But what success looks like for me comes down to obviously commercially keeping our company growing, advancing the mission, and definitely it continues to be a long game with that. But it's about about family and community and living true to my values. And for me, that continues to mean advancing what I'm doing with the company. I've got 2 kids under 3, and
Wow.
want to leave a better world for them. I also really enjoy with where I'm in my career, working with advising formally in some cases, or informally just through friendships, earlier stage entrepreneurs that are trying to put their ideas into action too. And I will also feel success by seeing those ventures go from concept to commercialization, whatever small role so it's just like a personal purpose, just kind of helping more people realize their full entrepreneurial capacity, and that there is this choose your own adventure aspect of it, and that if more of us took action on our ideas, the world would be a much better place. Do think with food waste and food loss, seeing there's like the very clear, more kind of KPI type things around new products being commercialized, what kind of presence we're seeing in every aisle of the grocery store, what kind of distribution those products have, what the same store sale, things are for that. And that's all fine, but like, and important for me, that's what it's only important personally, in that it, kind of advances that kind of personal purpose, aspect of it.
No, that makes total sense. And I see only big things for you and ReGrained in the future. So with that, Dan, I appreciate your time. This has been a great conversation. And
I enjoyed it.
Yeah, of course, man. Thank you.